Our panel title this morning is a very important topic. Why is it important for our indigenous peoples worldwide to participate in the United Nations system? And yes, there's debate on that. Is it really worth our time? What are the challenges? What is some of the work our presenters are doing within the UN bodies? They use that word in UN like they're bodies, human bodies, but there are bodies within the UN structure. That's what this session is. To open up, we have asked our relative here from the Amazon of Brazil, from Acre, Brazil, from the Hunakoi peoples, Chief Ninawa Hunakoi. He's both a leader, elected leader of his peoples, but he's also a spiritual leader. So I'd like to have Ninawa open up with a blessing.
Hush, 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 hush. Sitting, 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 sitting. Sitting, 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 sitting. Pushari, 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 pushari. Pushari, 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 pushari. Eram. Eram. Ao chai shani bu. Ao chai shani bu. Haburu Kooyooe bani, yo bani irakakan. Hiripaka piriri, hiripaka piriri, hiripaka piriri. Haburu Kooyooe bani, yo bani irakashun. Chai shani bu, ao chai shani bu, haburu Kooyooe bani, yo bani irakashun. Shout, 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 shout.
Thank you, Chief Ninawa. Over at the IN Eco office, can you prepare a sign with large number that says 5 minutes. A large sign, and I'm going to ask Bradley Angel or Manny or someone on the front row to flash up 5 minutes. That gives our speaker notification that you have 5 minutes left. We're not going to do one that says 0, but 5 minutes. So the office, bring me something that is large that says 5 minutes on it. That will help us. So each speaker has been informed they're going to have 15 minutes. And we're going to have translation for Chief Ninawa. What do you call that? There's 2 types of translation. Consecutive? What's the other one? Simultaneous. That's what we're going to do, simultaneous. So Chief Ninawa will be given about 25 minutes and 30 minutes, whatever it takes to translate for him. We have a interpreter that's going to come up. Cassandra is going to come up and sit by him. So 15 minutes each. So this plenary is going to recognize that it's been even over 50 years. We're not going to go into detail of the participation of the Haudenosaunee going to the League of Nations like long time ago, challenging the UN system and the governments of the world in this League of Nations process. Why aren't they reaching out to indigenous peoples of the world? So we do recognize the Haudenosaunee who took on that challenge. And there's a history for that, for you that are learners and students of the history of indigenous peoples' participation in the UN system. Some of our people here are very familiar with that story. But for time, we don't need to go into that. But it's very important, I want to mention. So each of the speakers have been very active in different UN initiatives. We're going to start out with Mr. Alberto Saldamando. He's been participating quite some time. He was on the working group on the development of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He has a long history of working in that capacity with the International Indian Treaty Council, which is a sister organization between IEN and IITC. We're related to each other. In the past years, he's transitioned to work with Indigenous Environmental Network on human rights and climate change. But he has an understanding of that history of why it's important for indigenous peoples to participate in the UN system. He's a human rights attorney on human rights, but also the collective rights, the inherent rights of indigenous peoples. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Mr. Saldamando. For the timekeepers, that 15 minutes is going to start when 20 seconds after he starts speaking. Hey. Alberto.
Thank you very much. Actually, the problem with visionaries is that they see the world as it should be. And then they assign people to make the changes that are necessary. And that's what our visionary leader does. But the task he's given us is monumental. What I would really request that each workshop leader give a brief summary of the theme and the action items that come under that workshop. Just a short paragraph if you would turn it into the information level, we can work something out so at least we can tell people tomorrow what the themes are and what the action items are, and then we'll do the rest later. I would really recommend that people attend the carbon pricing seminar, the Carbon Pricing 101, because there are, my brother Thomas has listed 4 major themes that we have to deal with every day and now, including now. And that's colonialism, racism, discrimination, and extraction. Those are the themes. Those are our relationship to the state. At least that's the way the state looks at it. Even at the beginning, when they started to colonize every place, not just the Americas, they would set up these phony companies, like the British East India Company. They're all crown chartered, but I call it privatized colonialism, privatized racism, and they're doing it today. There's major corporations that are out there, Apple, Meta, all these corporations are out there worldwide. There's OPEC, there's the oil cartels, and they're doing that. They're doing exactly that. They're extracting, and they're leaving nothing behind but poverty, and that's what it means for indigenous peoples. What we were talking earlier with some of the panelists really about what should be our relationship to the state. And there is a relationship that we have to deal with. Very few countries are independent that are also indigenous. Fiji may be one, where indigenous peoples really control their jurisdiction, their territory, their means of subsistence, their very identity. But for most indigenous peoples of the world, that's not possible. We have to deal with the state. We have to deal with what that relationship should be. And that's where I really, my work has been, I'm beginning to realize, really under treaties. Because when we go internationally, we deal with treaties. Not that the treaties between indigenous peoples and the crown or the state have global implications, but we have to establish our relationship. And our relationship is really based on respect. That word respect runs through everything that we do. Respect for ourselves, but also the government's respect for our traditions, our ways of life, our means of subsistence, our identity with the land, and our relationship to it, both material and spiritual. That's really what we want them to respect. They can try and clothe it in terms of, well, let's talk about being equal and being democratic, and this is democratic, everybody can vote, everybody can be equal, but that's not it. The real question is, the problem is respect. And I think when we look for systems change, which is really a major theme of indigenous just transition, we look at it from our respect for ourselves, and then use whatever means necessary to try and get the states to respect those traditions, those customs, that's the spiritual ways of our tribes and our identity with the land. So there's another internationally, in terms of treaties, there is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which I do on behalf of IEN. And that's a treaty. And it's a treaty amongst states. The Framework Convention on Climate Change does not say how they're going to reduce emissions. It only lays out certain principles. And one of those principles is differentiated responsibilities. A principle of the whole framework convention on climate change is that different countries have different responsibilities. The major polluters have a responsibility. There were 36 countries listed in under the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first how-to agreement that had to reduce their emissions by a certain percentage as determined by the International Panel on Climate Change. Now these are a lot of argle-bargle, a lot of initials, but to put it more simply, they were told the scientific basis for reductions of emissions. Had those been followed, then we would be living in a relatively different world, less catastrophic climate change. But then countries like the United States argued against it, and it is a political matter. The science is politics, and the science was, under that political examination, was changed. So the United States, under the Bush administration, reduced their obligation to reduce, and then they never signed the Kyoto Protocol. So they're faced with even where countries like the European Union had a European trading system, that failed, and that was supposed to be a legally binding obligation. The Kyoto Protocol was developed as an instrument as to how they were practically going to reduce their emissions. So then came along the Paris Agreement, because the legally binding obligations didn't work. Although they were legally binding, the countries just ignored them. The European Union tried it under the European trading system of reducing emissions, but their emissions actually went up 9%, even during the pandemic. So the Paris Agreement says, well, if legally binding obligations are not working, what are you willing to do? So that's what they call nationally determined contributions, with another word for commitments by the states to voluntarily reduce their emissions by certain percentages. There are a lot of technicalities involved that surround Article 6. But one of the things that Article 6 requires is that it contribute to sustainable development. And the fact is that that's really more like an oxymoron with regard to the states, because emissions are the problem. So when you start generating offsets, when you start putting a price on carbon, you're making it a valuable commodity. And so there's an incentive to produce more carbon when it's the carbon that's the problem. So the fact is that Article 6 of the Paris Agreement contradicts itself, because it allows countries to pretend that their emissions are somehow in the Amazon. Well, their emissions are up in the atmosphere. They're here. They're where they're generated. So IEN, one of the things that we've been taking to the negotiations at the Paris Agreement primarily is that there be a moratorium, no more exploration, keep it in the ground, use what's up here already been produced as a transition. And the fact is that we've had some successes. Some states are buying into that. And that's why they're beginning to realize, or they realize, the states, the countries, the member states of the Paris Agreement are realizing that emissions are the problem. So that's why one of the reasons why the Article 6 hasn't been fleshed out completely. It's 5 minutes? Because they don't know how to do it. So we have an opportunity to go in there and tell them again and again, reduce your emissions, forget about oil, go into alternative energy. And that's really, I guess, but those are when you take a look at this problem, It's a question of treaties, really, for international work. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is collective rights of indigenous peoples. So individuals are already covered by human rights. We all have the right to the freedom from torture. We have the right to assembly. We have all these rights already as individuals. But it's the collective rights of indigenous peoples, really, that must be respected. And the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples really mandates that internationally, that the collective rights of indigenous peoples be respected. That's the rights of self-determination, the right of sovereignty, the right to means of subsistence, the right to respect our identities, our lands, and our spiritual lives. And that really has been taken up by the Paris Agreement, and I know my sister Mary is going to be talking about that. But really, it's a matter of respect. The other word that's been used a lot is mobilization. We are mobilizing. I think if in the workshops that you've been attending, I'm sure that they've all talked about solidarity. They've all talked about an international movement of indigenous peoples. Also, with regard to the action items, really, and the question that was raised at the youth-sponsored panel was, how do non-indigenous peoples be involved? Well, we only really have about 3% of the world's population. We need allies. So part of our work internationally is working with non-indigenous lawyers. We have a group called the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group. There's a certain constituencies, the Enviros, or at least the CAN International, as well as the researchers, are also our allies. And they've taken up the indigenous perspective that we are part of the web of life. We are not the dominant, ours is not to dominate our relatives as called for by the Christian Bible, but it's really ours. We need to see ourselves as one species among many, that we have been given the voice that we can defend our brothers and sisters, the ones that crawl, the four-leggeds, the two-leggeds, the ones that swim and fly. We need to recognize that we are part of that web of life, and that we as humanity really are on the verge of extinction. So anyway, that's part of my recollection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alberto. It was good, working with Alberto in these global circles. I learned that a lot of our Spanish-speaking and indigenous peoples of the Americas, South Americas, have a lot of respect for Alberto, who participated with him in the drafting of the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. So he's been a really strong advocate globally with indigenous peoples and advocate for that. So he said, mentioned the word states. In that circle of the UN, all the governments of the world, we call them, there's a word called nation states. There's some debate on whether we say nation states, but usually we just say states. Not the states like in the United States, Tennessee, North Carolina, globally, the states or the governments. So thank you, Alberto. Alberto mentioned one of the UN bodies, one of the UN entities that's been created. Some of you remember the Earth Summit in 1992. Some of you that were around those days, you into musicians, Sting, S-T-I-N-G, he was there in the Earth Summit in South America, Rio de Janeiro. There's a lot of publicity around United Nations and the Earth Summit That's when the creation of one of the bodies that we're speaking about is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It took a couple years of the governments of the world to implement the first conference of the parties, the governments of the world, to come together at COP1 or COP2. Just in context, all these different UN bodies and different meetings, conferences of the parties, things like Conference of the Parties, there's a process under development. And indigenous peoples of the South, of the North, we always struggle on how do we engage in those bodies, because a friend of mine, Orrin Lyons, from the Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, he told me one time, if we're not there at the UN, and we're not there at the table, then we are the menu. We are the menu. So I remember he said that. So our next speaker is Tamra Gilbertson, and she's our coordinator of our climate justice program of IEN. And I have been working in the UN framework conference, the climate change conference, for years. It's very complex on climate policy, both locally, nationally, and globally. Trying to listen to the World Banks, the financial institutions who have a big stake in making money on climate change. And they have a big stake, in fact, on keeping investments in fossil fuels, the contradictions. The corporations participating in the UN system. There's a lot of publicity around corporate takeover of the UN framework on climate change. So we do see those contradictions as indigenous peoples. Very complex. Climate finance. But one thing that Alberto mentioned is Article 6. What is Article 6? What are the details of that we have framed that a lot of you may not understand? Why is that a climate fault solution? Why is it that the UN and the powers of the industrialized northern countries who are addicted, invested in fossil fuels are not making something that makes sense to us, make a transition to keep fossil fuels in the ground? Article 6, what is that? Alberto did an introduction, so I'm going to turn it over to Tamra, who is one of our experts, who is well-versed, a scholar, a researcher on the components of the contradictions of current climate policy and what we have been lifting up as a voice of indigenous peoples of IEN, demanding the large non-government organizations what they need to do, the governments, and finding governments in the global south that can become allies and organize our positions and our platform in the UN. Tamra.
Hey everyone, thank you all for being here, and thank you to our Cherokee hosts for having us on this beautiful land, and for all of the wonderful food and all of the heart and energy and minds that have gone into this. So really big shout out, and to the ops tent over there, all the people holding it down, and thank you to everyone. I'm really honored to be here today. And yeah, so why do we go to the UN? Increasingly, we have a lot of organizations that we work with that say, well, why bother? It's completely co-opted. Why spend all that money and time and resources to go to these spaces that are really that really represent colonialism? They represent a system of development that excludes people, that really aims to continue extractivism and extracting fossil fuels until the last drop is taken. Why bother? And it's true. It's a very difficult space to be in, to be surrounded by fossil fuel executives, lobbyists, lawyers with briefcases. The energy is very difficult to navigate and even to know how to engage. It's a difficult space. It's a lot of work. So why bother? Well, so I've thought about this really carefully, and instead of going into the policy wonkery around Article 6 and all of that first, I really want to sort of reflect and speak from my heart. And so I was thinking about this and why bother question. And one of the main reasons I think it's important to be there is because it helps us foresee what is to come. We learn in that space what they're planning before it's implemented. So we can come back and share that information and give warning. And I have many examples of that, and what IEN has done over the many years, being in that space, Alberto and Tom for over 30 years, and me for about 25 years. You know, collectively we joke sometimes that we have like 90 years or something together. But, you know, it helps us foresee what is to come. And in having that information, we can change the language that they use to try to translate it into an understandable language. Because it's not just a concept, or these are not just concepts, these are real world material consequences for Indigenous peoples and communities. And so that's one of the first things, one of the first reasons why we go. The second reason is sometimes, for example, we're here talking about just transition, which is incredibly important, and it's talked about in the UN spaces as well. And some people will say when we're fighting carbon markets and we're fighting against nature-based solutions and we're fighting against these capitalist programs that aim to keep fossil fuels coming out of the ground, they'll say, well, what's your solution? Or what do you, like, why is it so negative? But our resistance to these false solutions and these programs is our solution. That our resistance is absolutely critical in these spaces. And IEN and all of its leadership and board have held that line. And in that space at the UN, many organizations see IEN as a sort of, as a line of truth. Like, what's really happening? They come and ask people at IEN. And so for that reason as well, it's really important that we continue to be there. And I hope that as we move forward in the next couple years that are crucial, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, why, that we can do really good work, you know, getting this back. And I know that Govinda over at the media tent does great work getting this up on the radio and has done that for years. And we have many different fact sheets and information on the website to try to make this understandable because it's so complex and wonky, and they want it that way. That's done on purpose. But we have a strategy. We have a lot of strategy. And one of them is to find ways that we can engage. At the UN, there's really only a few ways of engaging. And one of them is through the constituency groups. So there's an Indigenous Peoples Caucus, there's a Women and Gender group, an environmental NGO group, a researcher group, a business group, and on and on. There are 9 of them. And one of our strategies is to try to be in more spaces of those constituency groups. And we've expanded in that area in the last few years, and that's been really effective. And we're seeing that be more effective as we move along. We also had a small victory a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, where the fossil fuel representatives that come in don't have to identify themselves as representing the fossil fuel industry. And we've changed that with a big, wide network of people so that they have to represent themselves on their badges that say that they are funded by a fossil fuel organization. It's a small victory, but it matters. Thanks, yeah. Well done, everyone, on that small victory. So that's been a really effective way for us to be able to see, for example, we've got numbers now that show that there are more fossil fuel representatives that are lobbying at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change than there are representatives of parties or nations. And that's incredibly alarming, but also shows us that they have a stronger force there, and that they're there and with a lot of people, which is also why we have increased our delegations in IEN to have a stronger force as well. Another issue here is that, and Alberto mentioned this and explained this really well, is that many indigenous nations are not recognized as individual parties. So we have nation states or parties that are recognized, and I believe that now there's 193 or 97, but indigenous nations are not. Indigenous nations are, meant to then work inside of the Indigenous Peoples Constituency Group, which is maybe a 2-minute intervention here or there. And it's a lot of scrambling so that there can still be a lot of backdoor deals when they close it down or when they have closed meetings. And this is something as well that is important to recognize and continue to think about and work on in the future. We've talked a lot about, or I've heard a lot of people talking about the importance of language in the last couple of days, and the power and the meaning behind language. And this is also a space where language is used to confuse. It's used to divide. Language is used to conflate issues or separate or cause conflict because meanings are different to different people. And one of those areas that we're seeing is in the area of underneath Article 6. The Paris Agreement has, I think, 19 articles. It's just a framework. And under Article 6 is the carbon trading, where you can buy and sell pollution credits and units. They're building a massive global framework like we've never seen before that's meant to be signed off on possibly by the next COP in Azerbaijan in November, but will likely go into next year. And within that is something called carbon capture and storage. This is a geoengineering technique where they sort of say that they can compress carbon dioxide, make it a liquid and put it underground. Most of it's to bring up gas and oil. And this is one of those areas where we have been able to foresee what is to come. Because we've been hearing about these carbon dioxide removals with carbon capture and storage, or CCS, for many, many years at the United Nations. And when the Biden administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act a couple years ago, we knew exactly what was to come because we had been at the UN following carbon dioxide removals and fighting against them in Article 6. So we were able to fight against the Inflation Reduction Act and understand exactly what was to come. And so many communities are now impacted by CCS pipelines, by CCS hubs, by hydrogen hubs, and many other false solutions that fall underneath the umbrella of carbon dioxide removals. That's one example of why it's been so important for us to be there. That resistance is our solution. That resistance is critical. And we're building resistance all over the world against CCS and other carbon dioxide removals. I want to shift a little bit in my last 5 minutes to the Convention on Biological Diversity. The CBD will be held in October in Cali, Colombia, from the 21st of October to the 1st of November. There are several issues here, and I'm just going to blaze through a few of them. The big focus will be around the Global Biodiversity Framework, sometimes called the Kuning Montreal Framework, or the GBF. Underneath the Global Biodiversity Framework, it was hailed as the success for including language on Indigenous peoples. But our analysis has shown that Indigenous peoples are mentioned are in 6 of the 23 targets, okay? Indigenous peoples are mentioned 10 times, but the language is weak. And where Indigenous peoples are mentioned, they're couched next to other types of false solutions. So we've done a big, deep dive into this. The researchers team, Elisa and Joshua, are here today. We're so happy to have all of their hard work with us. And underneath this, we're seeing certain issues. One is around nature-based solutions. Of course, IPs are right next to that. There's the conflation issue with Indigenous peoples and local communities at the CBD. They want to push in this next COP16 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, biodiversity offsets and credits that will then be harmonized over to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change with Article 6. So we're very concerned about what that so-called harmonization looks like. There are green bonds that they're pushing, payments for ecological services, and especially under Target 19. Under Target 3 is something called 30 by 30. This aims to designate 30% of Mother Earth's lands and waters as so-called, quote, protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs. Okay, this is this language soup that they use to confuse us. These are Indigenous peoples' territories, and they want to protect 30% of Mother Earth by 2030. And we know through the history of conservation what that means. Protection is not protecting those territories. Protection is taking those territories and stealing those territories from Indigenous peoples. So we are very concerned about what that looks like and how we are going to fight that. Our resistance is our solution. Okay? Got it. I gotta go. And last, Debt for Nature Swaps is on there. Digital sequencing information, where they sequence nucleic acid and DNA to take genetic resources. This is a big fight, and we have to beat this head on. This is one of the major fights. Biodiversity credits, I mentioned access and benefit sharing, so how people get access to money and funding, but this is not funding. This is financing. This is the World Bank. This is creation of debt. It shouldn't even be called financing. It should be called debt creation. Straight up. Yes. Yes. Blue carbon, basically taking the oceans, mangroves, waterways, and creating carbon credits and privatizing Mother Earth even more. And last, I want to say one other big victory that we're working on as well is in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, where we went in April to New York and we recommended a permanent moratorium on carbon trading and offsets, and we put that in there, and we will continue to fight in the Permanent Forum and all UN bodies until the privatization, the financialization of Mother Earth is ended. Our resistance is our solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tamra. That's why we are concerned we need to be there in these UN meetings. With this big money, we've seen the World Bank kick out millions of dollars, $4 million, $7 million, $3 million to indigenous intermediary organizations in the global south and at the regional level, enticing them, encouraging them to support these false solutions. They're telling our own brothers and sisters that this is benefit sharing, to take money in the commodification and the privatization of Mother Earth. That's all it's about. Before you can bring carbon into a white system, market system, you got to determine whose property right that is to trade it as a commodity. It's a property right issue. So who's trading? It's the profiteers of the polluting industry. Exxon, Shell, they are the ones that are marketing and benefiting. They own the carbon. You can say they're renting the carbon, but they own the carbon in the trees. They say, that's our trees now. And do we as indigenous people participate and say, no, that's our trees and we're going to trade? That's coming on the table too. How do we reconcile as indigenous peoples our own spiritual values to participate in a system that commodifies the sacredness of Mother Earth? That's a question we as indigenous people need to continue to talk amongst ourselves on. So our next speaker, thank you for the introduction of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. That's in New York City. And we have selected Ron Lameman that has been participating in that space as well as in other UN bodies. He has a long history of representation of his own folks in Alberta, Canada, so-called Canada, from the Beaver Lake Cree First Nations, but also they are representative of Treaty 6, the importance of treaty. And he's also been a long member of the board of the International Indian Treaty Council. He was at the Permanent Forum this past year, so we're going to have him speak on why do they participate in the Permanent Forum? What is the Permanent Forum and why should we have a presence there? And what are the challenges for continued participation in the Permanent Forum? Mr. Lameman.
Hai, the tamihin Tom. Nanas kumone be Xicano mota mina. E gonna go tai sino go toche. Wawi san ye kiteak kayas uta kagiut naskichek. E wahota ka nanto gapm sikik. We wow. E goma utaski wow. Egwa into kemochik steigi way. Good morning, everybody. Just saying a little bit in my Nihio language. Just thanking the people of this place, the ancestors of this beautiful place here, and thank you for the nation. And thank you for the nation for inviting us here, inviting IEN, as was mentioned, a sister organization of International Indian Treaty Council. And we're very pleased to be here. My wife and I, my younger brother, we drove down just to see Mother Earth between where we live and this place. And it's a very beautiful country. And as we traveled, we see what's happening to Mother Earth, where unsustainable activities are happening. We've seen it on the way here, and it's always an eye-opener. But I was asked to speak more specifically on the Permanent Forum, but I'll just give you a little background, and especially for the young people here. I'm glad that there is a lot of young people here, because when we started this work, we were young people too. Been doing this work 50 years, believe it or not. And when we started this work, we used to hear the elders pray for us that someday we would take up this work, we would have children, we would have grandchildren, and so on. And I saw that prayer become reality. Today we have 3 great-grandchildren, and very proud of them and love them dearly, and that's why we came all this way. We have a vested interest in their future, much like our ancestors did for us when they entered into treaty. Up in my country, there's different kinds of treaties. For lack of a better term, they call one set of treaties the number treaties. And we happen to be from treaty number 6, which was entered into in 1876. And we're coming up close to 150 years. We're going to commemorate that in a good way. And there's the Robinson-Huron treaties, pre-Confederation treaties, the Douglas treaties. And you can tell by my expressions, I'm a treaty person. I really believe in the treaty, not the written version, but the treaty as understood by our people. What was it non-Indigenous people wanted when they came to our territory? What was it? They were fleeing feudalism in Europe, where the prince or overlord wanted to tax them on everything. You couldn't even kill the king's deer. He owned everything. They came over here, and guess what they're doing to us now? The very same thing that they were fleeing from. So I guess you have to kind of forgive them a little bit. But now, so many years later, we're at the point of a very dire situation. We've been caretakers of this land for thousands of years, many, many years since time immemorial. And in just a few short years, they put us on this brink of destruction. So I've been doing this work with elders, with old people. When I started off as a young man, I would interview old people about our history, about the treaty and the treaty relationship. And fast forward to in the late 70s, early 80s, we couldn't find solutions at home. So they told us to reach out to other Indigenous peoples, go to the United Nations, go to England, to the Commonwealth. So we did that, a group of us. And while doing that, we met people like Alberto, many, many others that were doing this work. And so we were working at the working group on Indigenous peoples. And at the beginning, in a meeting room, not even as big as this, there was just a handful of us Indigenous peoples. The last working group, there was 2,000 people, Indigenous peoples from all over the world. So I guess that in itself tells you that it is being effective, the networking that we do. And again, the working group was working, but the powers that be said, well, it's outlived its mandate. We did a lot of good things during the working group, but then people wanted a permanent solution. So that thus came about the permanent forum. And I won't bore you with all the details because it was a lot of work, a lot of drafting, a lot of lobbying with governments, because for those of you that have been at the United Nations, you realize and you know that most of the work doesn't happen in the meeting room. You're meeting with governments, support groups, organizations that have influence in order to get your issues brought up on the floor and supported. So if somebody wants an overnight solution, that's not the place. Was young when I went there. Now I'm not young. I won't say I'm old, but it is very much needed. And I'll talk a little bit about the permanent forum. I went there and I met Tom, Alberto, quite a few other brothers and sisters that were there. And what really sort of resonated with me was the youth that were there, the youth that were lifted up. It kind of gives you hope that there is a future, that they will take up the torch and continue this work. However, that's not the place for solutions. It's a good place to go to meet people, to network, to strategize, to have side events and all that. But it's only an organization, a forum for making recommendations. And do I have 5 minutes left? Okay. Tell you a little story. One of my friends, still my friend, he got himself in some trouble at home. You might have heard of him. His name is Ed John. He used to be on the permanent forum. And so one time we invited him to our territory, Treaty 6 territory. So he came there, big fanfare, well-known person. So I was talking about the permanent forum, introducing him. And I said, permanent forum is a good place to go and network, get support, find out about other people's issues. And my friend here is a member of the permanent forum. But in reality, the permanent forum doesn't have any teeth, I said. They only have hard gums. And he didn't like that too much, but he knew what I was talking about. But it is good that we could get together, like the chief here, many people that we meet over there. We learn about their struggles. And this was even before social media. And the work Alberto and I did at the UN in Geneva, there wasn't even computers yet. We had to use these old typewriters, and then they became electric typewriters, and finally computers. But we set our own standards in that process. And so I'm not going to talk too much more, but in a few short words, yes, go to the permanent forum, but don't expect the answers overnight. And it's really a shame to me how much it's deteriorated to the point now where you get 3 minutes, sometimes 2 minutes. You spend a lot of money to get there, and then sometimes you get bumped by the governments because they take all the time that they need. And sometimes you won't even get on the speakers list. And it shouldn't be like that. If it's our forum, there should be more respect for people, especially elders, that made their way there and want to tell the world the situation at home. Try doing it in 3 minutes. Not possible. So with that, ay nanas kumon tatamihna ekse kamiyuki skans na ay.
Thank you. Acheha Padama Yato. One of the things that, thank you, Ron, one of the things that we always do in the delegation and our friends and allies that we know as Indigenous peoples that come to the permanent forum, but also other UN bodies, is expectations. We want to be upfront with them on expectations, what could be done with your participation here, and be upfront like Mr. Lameman has. And there are folks that in those UN systems that are friends and allies that are continuing to try to make change, so that we do an intervention instead of 3. It used to be 5 minutes, then it went down to 3. So yes. So our next speaker we have is Mona Polacca. Some of you may know Mona. She is still a member, and I think now the president now, or chair of the International Council of 13 Grandmothers. Some of you may know some of our grannies, our women that formed that entity, 13, balancing with the 13 moon, the moon cycle. They've been very effective throughout the years, speaking out globally, the indigenous grannies from different regions of the world. They invited me one year to come and speak with them. And I'm not a grandmother, but I am a grandpa and a great-grandpa. But I was speaking with them on a panel in Kyoto, Japan. I was at the end. So I respect them, honor them for their voices, and to invite a grandpa. But it was on some important issues on biodiversity and protection. So Mona is also our educator, our organizer on an initiative that we call our Indigenous Water Ethics Initiative. And we've been participating in the World Water Forum. Her years of participation in that, the formation of trying to have a world gathering on water and indigenous peoples, and how water is also reflective of peace, the concept of peace and protection of water. And she had met a lot of water advocates throughout the world who told us, and we said, we relate to that. She's going to speak to why she participates as our water person on the need for indigenous peoples, but also our traditional indigenous knowledge with water, why it's important. In the white world, they call that ethics. But the people we met in the World Water Forum that advocating water ethics, they say they're not being heard. The world water ministers of the world who represent government and corporations don't want ethics in water policy. We see that in Canada and United States. They don't want to recognize water ethics, let alone our own indigenous knowledge to be protection and equitable policies and protocols. It's a challenge. So I'm going to introduce Mona. She's got a story on this to speak to you. So Mona, thank you.
Kamiunya. I'd like to greet each and every one of you. A good morning, good afternoon, good day. I'm grateful to be here and give thanks for this beautiful day and all the divine creations, the water, the air, the fire, the sun, the earth, all these things that give us life. I am coming to you from my mother's people. I'm Havasupai, the people of the blue-green water from down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and I'm from the Water Clan. And on my father's side, I'm Hopi and Tewa, and from the Sun Clan and the Tobacco Clan. I'm grateful that the way that I was raised taught me that it's always important to acknowledge these things that give us our life. And those are the basic elements. And there's also what goes along with that are what we call the basic, the original instructions. the instructions that we as Indigenous people have been given. At the time when we first came into this world, according to the Hopi people, we were asked to live here, and Creator Maasau said we couldn't live here because we had already had a world we came from that we destroyed. And so what we had to do was we made a sacred covenant. We made a promise that we would not repeat the same things that destroyed the world that we came from, if we were given the opportunity to live here on Mother Earth. We made that sacred agreement, and that agreement was made among the 4 brothers, the red, the yellow, the black, and the white. And so along those lines, that's my foundation of how I embrace my walk in life and my responsibility as a woman, as a mother, as a grandmother, as a great-grandmother, to make it known that we have a sacred responsibility. As women, we carry life within us. Inside our womb, we have the sacred water that sustains the life of the unborn, and we must take care of it. The same happens when we come into this world, the first foundation of life being the water. And so, being from the water, my mother always told me that you have to be respectful of it. We must be respectful of this water because it gives life, but at the same time it can take life. And so there's this this balance that we must keep in order to be in harmony and live life in this world. Part of those teachings include what are called it's just a basic call to consciousness. And that basic call to consciousness is basically to be respectful of these elements that give us life. They're the foundation, and they are not man-made. However, in this day and age, it appears that we give almost religiously our entire lives to the technology and the man-made structures that we consider to be our living conveniences. And so in our work at IEN with the Indigenous water ethics, the effort is to create opportunities for Indigenous people to be able to have dialogue, as well as to recall or remember the foundations of our Indigenous knowledge and teachings about our relationship with water. And in order to do that, one of the things that happened was in 1993, in 2003, there was a Indigenous peoples gathering at the Kyoto Water Forum, and at that forum they developed a water declaration, recommendations, and in that recommendation, in that declaration, they made the recommendation that there be a working group of Indigenous people who would address the issues of water. And a good colleague of mine who is here today, her name is Dr. Darlene Sanderson, she was at this, and she heard the call. And in 2006, I met Darlene at the United Nations World Forum on Peace. And at that time, she met me and she said, we need to address the water issues of Indigenous people. We need to have a call on the United Nations to have a forum on water for Indigenous people. And so in 2007, we went to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples Issues. We never went there before, ever. We had no idea what the Permanent Forum process was like, and we didn't have any money either. But somehow we were able to go. Darlene came with $200, I came with a few dollars, and we had friends that gave us places to stay. And we met Tom there, and we had a meeting, and we talked about it. And he was in support, gave us guidance. We drafted our first intervention to the Permanent Forum for a call for Indigenous World Forum on Water and Peace. And at that time, in order to get a intervention on the agenda, and as was mentioned before, it's very difficult to get your item on the agenda and be heard for 3 minutes. And so everyone told us, no, you're probably not going to get on. It's not possible. There's too many people ahead of you. We proceeded to get sign-ons to our intervention by 36 Indigenous NGOs. And with that, we went to the program, the person who handles the agenda, and presented it to her. And she said, oh, there's no way you're going to get on. And Darlene said, but it's important. And the lady said, well, everybody's item is important. Darlene said, but it's about water. Isn't water important to you? And she said, yes. And she found a place to put it on the agenda. So we were able to present our intervention in 2007 at the Permanent Forum for the first time. We consistently attended, we garnered support from various Indigenous groups, asking them to submit statements to us about their concerns about water. And so we consistently presented these interventions at the Permanent Forum, and we were told that the only way you can get an intervention mentioned in the report is by a group of people who manage that report. And so over the years, it took us about 5 years to get us to the point where we finally kind of got an idea of what we needed to do. We did our intervention, went to the person who was chairing the group that was writing the report, and gave her our intervention and told her, you know, we were calling on her to make sure it got into the report. And we found out then that if you get one sentence about your intervention into that report, you've made a little headway. And so sure enough, we did get one little sentence about the Indigenous World Forum on Water and Peace. Eventually, there was we didn't get a whole permanent forum devoted to water. However, we did get half a day that was devoted to water issues. And it was very limited, of course, in scope as well as in participation by the Indigenous people who have major issues about their water. And so what we figured was we then are going to make efforts to do the Indigenous World Forum on Water and Peace in another way. And so thankfully, IEN has established the Indigenous Water Ethics Initiative and have asked me to join, and so I've come on board with IEN. And so the strategy we're now using initially is to create summits or symposiums among tribes in the various watersheds. And we had our first one in June in 2023 in Arizona, because that was the time we were in a mega drought. The Colorado River was drying up, and there was the lakes, the Lake Mead. There were threats to our hydroelectric dam in being able to have enough water in order for it to generate the electricity demands that the mega cities have in Arizona and in California. So we are in the process of setting up these symposiums where we are having various watershed regions, tribes come together and have a voice to speak about their concerns. We will give them more than 3 minutes. So we are moving forward with that. At the UN level, what we've done is we were able to get our foot in the door with the World Water Forum. At first, they were very resistant to having us participate, but in 2009, there was a delegation that did go to the World Water Forum in Istanbul. And then in 2012, a delegation were able to attend the World Water Forum in Marseille, France. And then at that point, that was the first time they actually let us in the door. Before that, we were doing side events outside the World Water Forum. We were able to get the World Water Forum to fund our participation at the World Water Forum in Marseille, and as well as in Brazil. And we also made headway with the World Water Forum, where we were given actually the Indigenous people had a program on Indigenous water issues. At each of these water forums, what we do, we believe that it's important to inform people who are the policy makers, the planners, the strategists. Those people must be informed on our issues and hear our voice. So that's my time. Thank you very much. Escalé.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mona. Eventually, the United Nations put together its first water conference last year that we participated in. And we also acknowledged the International Indian Treaty Council that also participated. One thing, if you contact Mona, catch her outside walking around, we have compiled a lot of indigenous declarations and statements, manifestos on water from throughout the world. We haven't put that on our webpage yet, but it's one of the goals to where you can go, where we have collected indigenous positions on water and the importance of water of life. Thank you, Mona. Now we're going to transition to some perspectives from community. People, as you know, we all come from community, and we are dealing with a lot of issues that affect our rights, our inherent rights, our collective rights as indigenous peoples. Also, as it affects Mother Earth, Father Sky, the ecosystem itself. So these next speakers are fighting the fight at home. They're going to share how those fights also engage at the global level, and how it's important to recognize methodologies and mechanisms to bring those issues as rights issues into the United Nations level, and also engage on some of the challenges they have. So our first speaker, thank him for doing the invocation. The prayer is Ninawa Hunakwai from Acre, Brazil, from the Amazon. Chief Ninawa. The interpreter, are you going to interpret? Who's going to interpret? Oh, there you are. She's always invisible. Okay, thank you, Cassandra. Cassandra has been one of the persons that's been a translator and interpreter with a lot of our indigenous peoples for years in New York City. Yeah, thank you, Cassandra.
Oi. Bom, obrigado, Tom, a todas as pessoas que já me antecederam com as suas experiências, as outras irmãs que vão falar depois. Agradecer a vocês que encheram esse plenário para nos ouvir. Isso para nós é muito importante. E eu queria pedir permissão para falar de pé.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you to my brothers and sisters on the panel, and thank you to every one of you who are here with us in the plenary and committed to protecting Mother Earth.
Eu vou falar de pé porque, para nós, líderes, no meu povo é muito importante que, quando a gente fala de pé, a gente fala com firmeza, com segurança, não tem dúvida. E, bom, tem muitas coisas que eu poderia compartilhar com vocês, as experiências das lutas que, não só o meu povo, mas como os povos indígenas no Brasil, na América do Sul, vem enfrentando. Mas tem umas questões muito pontuais que eu gostaria de poder compartilhar com vocês nesse momento.
I'm going to stand up because in our culture, it's very important for leaders to speak without any doubt, to speak with strength. And there's so much I would love to share with you about the challenges and struggles of the indigenous peoples of South America and of Brazil in particular. But I'm going to focus on some very specific challenges that my people are facing.
Nós estamos cercado de intenções pelo sistema governamental, principalmente, e é um sistema que é muito desonesto com nós que lutamos há milhões de anos pelo bem coletivo de toda a humanidade, de toda a biodiversidade.
We, as indigenous peoples, are under siege by government systems that are entirely dishonest. Nonetheless, we continue to struggle as we have struggled for millions of years.
Como já foi dito pelas pessoas anteriores, que dentro do nosso próprio território, nós somos considerados estrangeiros, pessoas de fora, porque os invasores, os colonizadores tentaram e continuam tentando nos invisibilizar de maneira total. E isso é ser muito desonesto com a gente.
So we continue to struggle to protect nature and to protect life. But we are treated like foreigners in our own territories. The colonizers erase us. They have made every effort to render us invisible. And this too is a form of dishonesty and an insult to the truth.
E que muitas das vezes, para ocupar esses espaços, como as Nações Unidas, entre outros espaços que tomam a decisão sem a nossa participação, às vezes a gente tem que se humilhar. E isso não é bom, não é ter respeito e igualdade. E principalmente reconhecer a nossa sabedoria ancestral.
So we see the necessity of participating in spaces like the United Nations, spaces that make decisions that affect us. And there are spaces that decide about our lives and our territories without our participation. This is not a good thing. This is a form of profound disrespect, not just to ourselves, but to our ancestors and our traditional knowledge systems.
Dentro desse sistema, há grande mal que hoje tem afetado amplamente os povos indígenas, que a gente conhece como a corrupção.
These decision-making systems like the UN are fundamentally evil and are harming indigenous peoples of the world.
Com esse modelo de tentar, no Brasil, dizem que é integrar a população indígena à sociedade nacional. Isso significa que essa integração é acabar com a história, matar a história dos povos indígenas, colocar os povos indígenas como igual a qualquer outro cidadão colonizador que chegou dentro do nosso território.
So I'm sure you're familiar with a model that colonizers have used throughout the world that the government of Brazil also uses, and that is forced assimilation of indigenous peoples into national societies. But make no mistake, forced assimilation is an extermination agenda. Its purpose is to kill the history of indigenous peoples and to disappear us and just lump us into the general population.
Nesse modelo do sistema governamental, no Brasil, tem mudado muito a relação dos povos indígenas. Tem tido uma grande separação entre as lideranças indígenas por meio dessa corrupção. Lideranças que sempre estiveram à frente do movimento, na luta, junto coletivamente, hoje a maioria foram cooptados pelo sistema de governo. No meu estado, pessoas, amigos, irmãos de luta, que foram cooptados hoje para estar junto com o governo. Isso faz uma diferença muito grande para o enfraquecimento da luta dos povos indígenas e também enfraquece a luta pela perda fortalece a perda de direito nosso, seja local, seja a nível nacional.
So, a corollary of this assimilation model implemented by governments like Brazil has very adverse impacts for us. And currently, we're seeing that one of the adverse impacts of the corruption and strategic forced assimilation of indigenous peoples is the creation of a terrible rift, a terrible division amongst indigenous leaders who have been at the front lines in our struggles for many years. I'm talking about the systematic co-optation of brothers and sisters and friends of mine who have a history as distinguished leaders of indigenous peoples, who unfortunately now have been co-opted by the government. This is weakening our struggle, and it's weakening our ability to defend Mother Earth and life.
É muito triste quando a gente tem os nossos irmãos de luta, que a gente vem, eu venho muitas vezes nas COPs, tenho acompanhado, e de ver pessoas que antes a gente no Brasil lutava junto e hoje está defendendo os interesses também dos governos, principalmente na região amazônica, quando fala das mudanças climáticas, a maioria das nossas lideranças estão cooptadas por instituições internacionais que são negociadores de crédito de carbono, que são pessoas que estão sentados junto com os petroleiros, com as madeireiras, com as mineradoras, querendo também receber um pouco desse recurso. E quando olha para a gente que não aceita esse tipo de negociação, vê a gente como se fosse o inimigo, por mais que a gente vem muitos anos lutando junto. E isso são estratégias de governo para enfraquecer o movimento indígena, para poder se apoderar dos nossos territórios. Hoje, na última COP, agora em Dubai, o governo do estado do Acre assinou o RED jurisdicional no nosso estado. Esse RED jurisdicional, o governo do estado se apodera de todos os territórios de área de conservação, de preservação ambiental, incluindo as terras indígenas, que são de domínio de leis federais. Então, essa estratégia, ela faz a cooptação, ela faz a divisão entre os líderes, ela retira os nossos direitos originários da terra, né? Tudo para poder entregar para essas companhias fazerem a extração, principalmente a negociação com os créditos de carbono.
This division of the indigenous peoples movements really saddens my heart. It's so painful to see brothers and sisters of the struggle who have been co-opted and who are paraded around in the conference of the parties, which are the big summits of these UN conventions. And I'm so pained because back in Brazil for so many years, we fought, we struggled shoulder to shoulder together. And now I see them in the halls of the United Nations defending the government's agenda. This co-optation is particularly marked and widespread with indigenous leaders from the Amazon. They're being co-opted and bought out to be in favor of carbon markets, in favor of doing what's called REDD, which is carbon credits based on our forests, based on the Amazon. And these carbon credits are permits to pollute for big oil and for logging companies and for the polluters of the world. And these Amazonian leaders who were my brothers and sisters are selling out for crumbs. And when we run into each other in the UN, they look at me as if I was the enemy, because I'm still protecting the Amazon and opposing this new colonialism of carbon markets. Now, I also want to say that carbon markets in any form is a strategy, a worldwide strategy to take over our territories and our land. We saw that very clearly at the latest climate summit that was held in Dubai. I saw leaders from my own state being led around by government delegates so that they could speak in favor of RED and using their territories for carbon credits and for a particular form of RED, which is province to province rather than state to state, which is called, or country to country, which is called jurisdictional RED.
No estado do Acre, nessa discussão das compensações ambientais, das soluções baseadas na natureza, foi a vitrine. Quando, em 2010, criaram um projeto de lei, em parceria com o estado de Chiapas, no México, o estado de Califórnia, e houve uma grande mentira do governo do estado quando disse que consultou todos os povos indígenas, consultou a cidade, todo mundo da cidade, as comunidades tradicionais, para poder implementar um projeto a lei de compensação ambiental a nível do estado. E as nossas maiores organizações a nível de Amazônia Legal, as organizações indígenas, elas estão cooptadas por esse sistema. A gente vê os nossos grandes líderes, que a gente tem respeito, tratando a gente com indiferença quando a gente não aceita. E nos diz ainda que nós estamos atrapalhando as negociações. Que nós estamos sendo contra a nossa população. Mas, na verdade, nós não estamos sendo contra. Nós estamos defendendo a nossa essência da vida, que é respeitar a natureza para que ela não se vire mercadoria para as grandes corporações. Por isso que nós chamamos de falsas soluções, porque nas COP, a gente vê nos grandes painéis o nome das corporações que financiam a COP, que financiam os governos. E o governo fica chateado comigo quando eu digo que eles só são gerentes das empresas, dessas companhias, nos seus países, que vão executar esses recursos, e não fazem da forma que quer, porque as companhias que obrigam. Por isso que eu gosto muito da ideia de quando Nova Zelândia, o povo Maori com outros povos lutaram para reconhecer o rio como um sujeito de direito. Como Saraiaco começaram a trabalhar isso no Equador, em reconhecer o território como sujeito de direito, na causa Sacha, não sei se ainda continua. Então, é uma estratégia importante que nós temos que ter isso na nossa consciência, de que o nosso território é um ser sagrado, é um ser de vida. E isso, espaço como as Nações Unidas, não querem reconhecer, como não queria reconhecer, o tema da água para os povos indígenas. No último fórum, agora permanente, estava com Tamra, com Tom lá, eu pedi para fazer uma fala que as Nações Unidas têm que colocar no centro de discussão também a espiritualidade dos povos indígenas. Eu fiz esse pedido também, mas não sei se ouviram, se vão dizer alguma coisa depois. Então, a gente precisa colocar também a importância de que nesses espaços internacionais a Unesco tem que reconhecer a espiritualidade, a sabedoria ancestral dos povos indígenas como um tema importante também, e reconhecer os territórios como um sujeito de direito.
So, the whole state of Acre wants to use indigenous peoples' territories, protected areas, basically all the land for the carbon markets. And that is why they are so aggressively co-opting indigenous leaders and creating division amongst us. Because basically their end game is to terminate or exterminate our rights to our lands and territories and resources. Really put all of life into the carbon market and the biodiversity credit market. And for this purpose, they passed a law in 2010, which cemented my state, Acre, and Chiapas, Mexico, as the prototypes for California Red. So basically the governors, since the UN wasn't going fast enough, the governor of California started reaching out to other governors to do red with the choicest forests of the world. And they say that they're protecting the forest, but it is a terrible lie. The government of Acre said that they consulted with the indigenous peoples and that we approved this California Red project, but that is completely untrue. We never granted our free, prior, informed consent. Nonetheless, they are just railroading through the implementation of these carbon market projects and continuing to co-opt more leaders. And the leaders who have sold out say that those of us who continue to resist are blocking progress for our peoples. But we're not against these brothers and sisters. We are just absolutely committed to defending the essence of life and nature, to make sure that nature is not commodified for false solutions to the climate emergency. So in the climate summits, if you go, you will see huge billboards of extractive industries saying that they're green and clean, but this is all greenwash propaganda based on stealing our territories. Now, the government of Brazil and the government of the state of Acre is really angry with me for speaking out and opposing this massive land grab of our territories. But I look to my brothers and sisters of the Maori people in Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, and how they're protecting the rights of rivers, and also how my brothers and sisters in Sarayaco in the Ecuadorian Amazon are trying to enshrine the rights of the forest with their Sasha Causa proposal, because the bottom line is that our territories are sacred beings. Maybe the UN doesn't want to recognize it, but that is the truth. I recently, this spring, was at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous peoples, not indigenous issues, and I spoke about the need for the UN to recognize the spirituality of indigenous peoples, because that is the real key to protecting life. The UN has to base its work on the recognition of indigenous people's spirituality and our guidance based on our traditional ancestral knowledge systems and our caretaking of our territories.
Então seria isso que eu queria poder compartilhar e dizer que nós estamos num momento muito importante para tomar as nossas decisões, assumir as nossas bandeiras de luta, defender a natureza, porque ela está pedindo, há muito tempo a natureza vem pedindo a nossa ajuda, pedindo o socorro. E para finalizar, eu gostaria de enfatizar mais uma vez o que eu falei ontem aqui. Nós, povos indígenas do Brasil, estamos pedindo o apoio de vocês a nível internacional. Dia 5, daqui 2 dias, a Suprema Corte vai colocar na mesa, em negociação, os direitos dos povos indígenas, os direitos sobre as terras, os direitos da nossa existência enquanto povos. E isso nos coloca em risco para uma extinção lenta por meio das aplicações das leis do sistema, que querem acabar. Então, tudo isso tem a ver, são ações estratégicas do Congresso Nacional para acabar com os povos indígenas, acabar com os territórios dos povos indígenas, para entregar para essas grandes corporações que só querem destruir. E que não é diferente em outras regiões. A nossa luta, como eu falei ontem também, a principal luta nossa é a luta pela terra, porque a luta pelo nosso território é garantir a nossa existência. E nós não podemos deixar que as nossas gerações futuras sejam extinguidas em câmera lenta por esse sistema. Vamos levantar, vamos dar força, vamos unir mundialmente para ir para os campos de guerra, como a gente fazia anteriormente. Para quem é daqui, do norte da América, já sabe o que passaram. A mesma coisa que passaram aqui no Norte da América, estão querendo fazer com nós no Sul da América também. Né? E vocês sabem como foi doloroso. Precisamos unir força para poder vencer pelo menos alguma coisa dentro dessa nossa luta. Eu vejo pessoas com mais idade do que eu, que começaram essa luta como jovem. Eu também comecei como jovem, hoje já sou um jovem mais adulto, mas nós temos que ensinar a juventude pelos caminhos mais verdadeiros para a gente lutar. No Brasil também tem uma ação do governo que financia o agronegócio, que é quem está acabando com a nossa floresta, com a agropecuária também. E o governo financia, 70% desse recurso é financiado para o agronegócio para desmatar. E agora estão financiando para fazer a monocultura, para fazer a negociação de crédito de carbono. Então nós não aceitamos isso. Isso é importante, que o mundo inteiro tem que saber. Muito obrigado pelo tempo, pela oportunidade, pelo convite. E dizer que eu falo isso com muito carinho, vem do meu coração, são realidades. Muita gente que pode escutar isso pelas mídias sociais lá fora, vai ficar chateado com o que eu falo, porque é verdade o que muitos de nossos líderes, tanto políticos quanto líderes indígenas, tentam esconder. Mas eu não tenho medo de falar a verdade. Obrigado.
So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. Obviously, brothers and sisters, we are at a crucial crossroads in the defense of Mother Earth and the defense of nature. She is imploring us to defend her. She has been crying out for some time, and we can hear her. I want to emphasize that the indigenous peoples of Brazil are asking for support and solidarity. We are facing an all-out offensive in terms of the legal framework in Brazil on indigenous people's rights. The Supreme Court and the Congress are considering a law that would basically terminate our rights and our recognition of our existence as indigenous peoples and threatens our very existence. This is a very strategic attack that has been launched by the National Congress and now is being considered by the Supreme Court. But the upshot of this bill is a termination agenda. It will disappear Indigenous peoples and hand our land over on a silver platter to the extractive industries. But we are not going to stand idly by. We need your support in this crucial struggle right now, because we know that we struggle to defend our land because land is what guarantees our continuation as a people. So, brothers and sisters, let us rise up. Let us unite. Let us play our drums. I know that my brothers and sisters from the north know what we are going through in the South because it happened to you 100 or 200 years ago. We know that you know our pain. So this is a time to show us solidarity and for us to build power and share our strengths. I myself started as a leader when I was a very young man, and we know that it is absolutely key to include our youth in our struggles. In Brazil, we're up against a very aggressive agro-business lobby. Also, the fish farms are also encroaching on our territory, and they get subsidies from the government. 70% of that money for the agro-business goes to clear cut the Amazon for soy plantations and other kinds of plantations, as well as to replace the Amazon with monoculture tree plantations for carbon credits. So please tell the world, tell your peoples what is going on in Brazil. I thank you with my whole heart. I invite you to my territory, and do not doubt for one moment that what I have said is anything but the truth. I've spoken from my heart about the reality we face, and I know that there are consequences for speaking out, but I am a man who knows no fear.
Não ao marco temporal. Não ao marco temporal. Demarcação já.
So let's stand united against this law in Brazil and continue to defend the demarcation and titling of our territories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mother Earth is not for sale. Mother Earth is not for sale. Everyone say that. Father Sky is not for sale. Who knows about the World Trade Organization? The WTO of the sky. We will not allow that to happen. The WTO of the sky. The commodification and privatization of Mother Earth. The trees, the plants, the grass, the plankton in the oceans. They're even now reaching out to the whales, our relatives, the whales, as a carbon offset. They're even including buffalo as carbon offsets, and even spiders. This is part of something our elders in some of the prophecies said everything is going to be for sale. We know water is for sale now, commodified. Now air is being commodified by carbon trading, carbon offset, and now our own relatives. When is it that we will be a carbon offset? So that's why it's very critical. Before we invite our last two speakers, we have a half hour left. Is one thing I just want to give attention to Mr. Michael Lane as a resource person. If you can stand, Michael Lane, where are you? He's way in the back. I'd like to recognize him. He works on our inherent relationship jurisprudence initiative. We're also challenging in that the rights of nature to strengthen the recognition of how we define our relationship to Mother Earth and Father Sky. Well, why I recognize him real quick is that some of the issues that came up on the termination agenda is very important. Is that the co-optation that we see is happening here in the United States and Canada. Our own indigenous nations are being sold out. They're drinking the Kool-Aid to take the money from carbon trading, which is in the millions of dollars, spanning over 99-year contracts, signing away their sovereignty on these contracts. Money talks, you heard that in that world out there. So we got a lot of work to do here back home in our homelands. Alaska and the forest is going on as well. A lot of work. We have carbon trading, a carbon pricing workshop this afternoon that starts. That's another place you can get more information. Thomas Joseph is narrating that session. We have one on hoodwinked. The hoodwinked booklets are being passed around. In that, we're exposing, this is a joint operation between IEN and other community-based organizations, other researchers on what we're talking about and more. We have one person here from fighting hydrogen energy in Southern California from the Kooyooe. Roseanne Hamilton, are you here? Roseanne. Right here, Roseanne, she's fighting. She's at ground zero fighting that will possibly be a world's largest hydrogen hub in Southern California. And they're calling it green energy, blue energy. Green energy is not a solution. Let me say that again. Green energy, green hydrogen is not a solution. I know there are some allies in the environmental movement here that says, well, green energy, green hydrogen's okay. But she's here to speak on one of the panels, so I wanted to say that. And the other thing Michael Lane is pushing is protocols, equitable protocols, because in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they are starting to recognize traditional indigenous knowledge. And we're very scared. We have already seen the co-optation of these intermediaries that Ninua talked about, our own indigenous leadership, our brothers and sisters, bringing knowledge holders into the UN system that will not say, no, we are against false solution. They are saying it's okay, that there's a way we can work this out. So they're co-opting traditional indigenous knowledge now. So there needs to be protocol as they're starting to capture our language, our knowledge, and what are the protocols to protect our knowledge. So those are things that Michael has lifted up. So we have a sister here that has come all the way from the territories of the Maori peoples, so-called New Zealand. And they are fighting the fight. There's things that they are struggling against is the termination agenda. The same issues as abrogation. So she hears to speak, but also on how it's important for them at that community level to bring these issues into the international realm, and also it's a rights issue in the United Nations system. So please recognize Tina. Tina, who is here, Tina Ngata.
Kia ora. Tēnā tātou. I wanted to take a moment to recognise just and acknowledge and thank all of my fellow speakers just for the integrity, and to thank IEN for pulling this forum together. As somebody who's involved on the ground at home in opposing carbon markets, which is often discussions with our own elders and our own leaders, I can't overstate what it means for my heart to listen to the messages. Excuse me, it's emotional. Just to listen to the messages that are being voiced today from the people holding the positions that you are. It's very hard to drive some of these discussions at home on the ground. So every time I hear you protect the sacredness of our Mother Earth, prioritize her sacredness, and hold this discussion with such integrity, it just fills me with joy and gives me energy to continue the discussions that we need to have at home. So thank you. Tēnā koutou. This year marks 100 years since our people, Māori, first engaged in transnational forums of colonizers, and it was at the League of Nations in 1924, 1 year after Desgahe had first gone there, that our elder, Wiremu Tahupōtiki Rātana, went to the League of Nations to say, we are a nation. And he presented a petition with tens of thousands of signatures. I got the number wrong earlier today. It was actually 30,000 Māori signatures calling for the so-called New Zealand government to honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And I want to mention that because those were 30,000 signatures at a time when there were only just over 50,000 Māori in existence. We were at our lowest population count at that time because of disease and colonisation. So that accounted for over 95% of our population. We didn't even have cars. Most of our nation didn't have roads. The effort that it took to get those tens of thousands of signatures on that petition to take to the League of Nations, to tell them that we expect our treaty to be honoured and respected, is an incredible effort. And for me to think that 100 years later, we're back here again with the greatest assault upon our treaty that we've seen in our history and our known and spoken history since the treaty came into existence in 1840. Where our New Zealand, so-called New Zealand government is this week debating the Treaty Principles Bill. The Treaty Principles Bill is proposed legislation that will reinterpret our treaty without our consent. Unilaterally, the Crown will unilaterally reinterpret our treaty without our consent. And they have literally proposed that sovereignty belongs to all peoples. To take the sovereignty promised to our people in our treaty and give that to all peoples. And so, you know, to think that this is still the struggle, and in fact it's gotten worse after 100 years, really makes me think about how within these systems, within these colonially crafted systems that are created by colonial forces and still dominated by colonial forces, how do we protect the incredible integrity and dignity of the messages that our Indigenous leaders have in that space? I do believe that we still have to continue to go to that space because that history matters. Our ancestors fought to have our voice in that space, and we have to continue to hold that with that same integrity. One of my favorite quotes from a civil rights leader and artist, Zora Hurston, says that if you don't stand up and speak to your pain, your oppressor will kill you and tell everyone you loved it. And that is why we have to hold that space in the United Nations, because it is a space of colonial abusers. And in our absence, they will continue to abuse us and tell everyone that we love it. That is why we keep going back there. It is not an exclusion of creating our own international forums. We must do that too. We must forge ahead with finding our own spaces. But we also have to be there representing our struggles directly in that space and allow for the fullness of that to happen. And also continue to fight for the integrity of our voices in that space, to identify the systems, the weaponization of those systems, and the weaponization of that language that works to diminish the integrity of our voice in that space, in the UN. And that requires a number of different pieces of knowledge and skills, right? So that requires not just, our Indigenous wisdom and our Indigenous knowledge, and it's important. It's also important for us to hold on to our sacredness, to recognize the ceremonies that keep us grounded in communities when we go into a colonial space that is sacredless. Colonial spaces are bereft of sacredness. They are sacredless. So we have to ensure when we go into that space that we deliberately and intentionally ground ourselves in community so that we're not pulled along with those sacredless forces that dominate that space. And so it's important that we hold on to those things. It's also important, though, that we have this wisdom and knowledge from people like, when I first came to the United Nations, I think it was like 2012, I was so fortunate that Evie and Tupac were two of the first people that I met in that space, and they provided me with incredible guidance over the years on how to keep our voices effective and also to maintain the integrity of our conduct in that space. So it also requires that kind of wisdom and guidance of people who understand the way in which that language makes a difference. I also want to acknowledge in that space the work by, Charmaine Whiteface. The resource that's in this book just so clearly outlines the way in which language is weaponized to diminish the intent and spirit of what it is that we are trying to achieve in that space. It is an incredible resource for people who want to understand the colonial weaponry that is used against us in that space. And so all of these things are really important for us to be able to work effectively and to manage our strategy and to not get caught up in those processes that have functioned to even weaponize us against each other and create division within our communities in that space, to avoid that kind of conflict that divides us all in that space. One of the action points that we would like to advance is that for us, particularly when I see people who are new to that space, and I've been advising our communities on how to be effective in that space, we need training. We need training for our people to be able to operate in that space on how to write interventions, on how to use the right kind of language, on how to identify harmful language, and how to circumvent colonial, what's the nice word? The way in which they mess around with our intentions and the way in which we're heading. So if there is any way that IEN can support us to establish and stand up an international Indigenous diplomacy program that underpins all of these things, staying in connection to community, remembering our sacredness, being aware, having an anti-colonial analysis on what is going on so that we can potentiate our time in that space, for me that would be a really helpful outcome. I've seen one of the things that we see also in the UN space, there are people who just go into that space and use it in bad faith. They don't use it well, and they're not connected to community, and they don't have mandate from their community to speak in that space. But also I've seen our youth go into that space without the support of elders. Thank you. Without the support of elders, and for us, we have a responsibility to work with youth, to support them Otherwise, it can be a really harmful space for them too. And I've seen youth, their first and last interaction in global politics was at a UN space where they were unsupported and wound up becoming quite shamed of their actions. So more, whatever support we can give to make sure that that space is utilized properly, we would really greatly appreciate that as well. I think I wanted to thank you also for reconciling the idea that we must reconcile and marry together our Indigenous values, our overarching Indigenous values, with our actions in that space. I appreciate the regard that's been paid towards us for some of the protections, but also we need to be able and willing to humbly sit back and consider the way in which we are feeding into these processes. Some of our own leaders in Aotearoa are huge carbon traders, massive carbon traders. And so we need these spaces to be able to come in, have these discussions with integrity and respect and love for each other, but also unapologetically and with integrity address these key issues around the commodification of the sacredness of Papatuanuku, our Earth Mother, Rangi Nui, our Sky Father. So I'm going to leave it there because I think I'm out of time, but I just wanted to thank you again for the integrity of the voices and what's being said here. Kia ora ra, tēnā koutou.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina. Our final speaker. One thing as a protocol with our network is that, yes, we take our staff, but our staff also are building a base with communities. We are a network. We are grassroots as well, community-based constituency. So we ask our organizers always to establish relationship with communities. Many of them are dealing with a lot of different issues. So as wearing an organizer, Indigenous organizer hat, they're establishing that relationship. So we try to always commit, bring in community representation, people who are in the front line with us. So our next speaker, she prefers to be called Great-Grandmother Mary Lyons. And she comes from northern Minnesota. She's Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and she's one of the Line 3 water protectors. And she also is an educator and traditional knowledge holder on the Anishinaabe ways. So we invited her to take part in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Conference of the Parties. So she came as a grassroots. She's going to share her impressions coming into a complex system. But the arena we invited her to participate is an area to where we talked about traditional Indigenous knowledge now being recognized in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, coming out as one of the articles woven into the the Paris Accord of 2015 of the UN climate meeting. And this is within a body called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. Michael Lane is very versed on this. And within the local communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform entity within the UN framework, it's a constituency body, which means it has a higher status. It can meet and make recommendations directly to the COP. So it has some power and status to it. But like you heard from interventions, we have seen a pattern of co-optation of indigenous peoples that are coming within that entity to talk about traditional knowledge. So I'm going to just quickly read as part of the introduction that great-grandmother Mary Lyons has been brought into the UN meeting to be there as a knowledge holder within the facilitating working group of the local communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform constituency body. The platform promotes the exchange of experience and best practices. That's a word we got to watch out for. Experience and best practices with a view to applying, strengthening, protecting, and preserving traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, our local knowledge. We have concerns of the conflation now of indigenous peoples with the political and legal status globally now being conflated with local communities. So knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems, as well as technologies, practice and efforts of local communities and indigenous peoples related to addressing and responding to climate change, taking into account the free, prior, and informed consent, and the holders of such knowledge, innovation, and practices. Woven into those, in that language, those that have been experienced, they're pushing technologies that were mentioned that's in that hoodwink booklet that we already talked about, technologies, practices, and they're manipulating that. So we like and appreciate some of the comments and observations of my sister, your auntie, your granny, your daughter, great-grandmother Mary Lyons, and what she has experienced by attending the COP meetings. Great-grandmother Mary Lyons, how?
Is this on? I say a greetings to the ancestors of this land. You see, each time you walk into somebody's house, you must acknowledge that blood memory. And what Tom is talking about, and what I really appreciate, each one of my brothers and sisters, and it's like my daughters and my sons, my grandchildren, right? We call us our universal family. And it's been an honor to walk in this space as I learned. Because when I first entered this space, I entered it at the UN within the women's section in the February because there was no Indigenous women there and we had to bring our voices forward. I have some relatives here. I think, I don't know, Betty, are you here, Betty Lyons? And the Onondaga group. You know, when I first got there, Muriel and all the Onondaga people there embraced me. But I went into that arena, not with Indigenous people. I needed to go in there and hear. I went in there just as a woman. But what I heard and how they treated me brought real sorrow to my face because I knew they loved using the word Indigenous, but they did not like being in our presence. And I found that out by them continually telling me to go put my little outfit on. Well, I sat with that for a while because I knew we had to have voices into the April platform. And we were trying to do our best to get people there because we had to hear and spread the words at that particular time because myself, even being as young as I am, I resent that word old, mature, right? And wait a minute, before I get going here, I want to first apologize for having the best seat in the house, air conditioning, right? So, to hurry this up, what happened within a lot of the arenas in that there, we still had to step back because our voices were bringing our community concerns forward, and yet we still have other brothers and sisters throughout the globe that weren't getting their chance. So we put a call out to the world, and we were invited. I was invited by my Inuit brother Nganga to Greenland. We were invited all over the planet to sit amongst their lands, not to be in hotels, but to be on the grounds like we're here. To get to know their food systems, their air systems, their water systems, their plant life, everything. We sat amongst them. And when we came back, we still walked into the arenas and this stuff. And one particular time when I did walk back into the arenas, because you know, I am from that era of the beginning of the American Indian movement. I am from that beginning of the struggles and the stuff from Line 3 that just didn't happen a few years ago. That planning was well before 1968. That first line that was put through our territories when our tribes at that particular time were just dirt poor. And when I mean that, that's how they described it. But to us Anishinaabes, we were just rich within family and everything. But that was slowly manipulated prior to 1968 by the dismantlement of families. So we had hard times ahead of us. The burdens that we carried, and many of you know who I am. I'm Anishinaabe, but I'm a Dewan. I am part of that order of just being normal, just appreciating the values of those four elements. The values of being a caretaker. Because you see, we all have our stories of entrance. We particularly believe we come from the stars. Our spirit enters the womb and the pools of our mother. The first introduction is water, the downloading of that blood memory, and then coming out, taking that first breath of air and feeling that fire, and then planting our feet on earth and nourishing it. And a place we're going to call home for a very, very brief time, very brief time. And within this arena and this teachings and this guidance of who we were to be, that title said caretaker. It did not say landlord. But we knew within those arenas of discussion of all those seers that seen what was coming beforehand. And it wasn't so much we were warned, we were taught how we would maneuver through it, because we would survive these trying times if we stuck to the blood memory and the knowledge of who we are as original caretakers. Does that make sense? It's very, applaud your ancestors, don't applaud me. Because you know what? We even say this to a lot of the people. You know, these are our homelands, but yet we're still the invisible people, because people will always ask me, oh, what country are you from? It saddens me, and before it used to make me angry, but today it makes me more sad for them because they forgot their ancestors and what they went through to make sure they were breathing this life that they're in today. So I had to learn quickly, right? Every time you feel that amount of anger in you, you have to step back and examine it and find that balance. And this was the entrance to going into the COPs and to being a knowledge holder and just examining what is going on and finding out what we are knowing today and what IEN and everything is. It's not so much as pushing forward, but they built a bigger table, right? All the allies and stuff built a bigger table for everybody to feast off from, just like this food we have here. But I remember going into some of those platforms and this stuff, and all the people that I was with, oh my gosh, they know more ABCs than I even know 1, 2, 3s and this stuff, FWG, SBG, and it was going on, and it was just zooming over my head, and I was thinking, wait a minute, I'm a seer, and I'm a feeler, and I'm having download, and sometimes I'd have to walk behind Tom because it was too much friction of energy, and that what happened to me in Glasgow, what made me go home to my elder to say, I don't think I can do this. But it was sold, you have to walk, you made a commitment. You start something, you need to finish it, because this is what Creator put before you. So trying to understand, I was very blessed with each one of these people. Many of you in here and many people all over in this stuff took time, because I like to visit and tell me, I'd listen to your stories, but you would help guide me through certain things and that was happening. But one of the things in conclusion that I found out that was missing was us. It's not even so much as the brown and black people, but it was people of all colors that were struggling for a wellness of this planet. We weren't there. And so we had to bring that voice louder. And it was amazing of how little what you hear they say, even if it's a few minutes they get to say it. But it's the energy they brought into that room that made those suits nervous. I witnessed it. Tom and them would walk in with their ribbon shirts. You would see Chief Nimawa with his headdress. You would see all territories and his stuff dressed in who they were. Made the hierarchy that is destroying this planet nervous. You have to be the elephant in the room. You have to move forward. You have to be there. Because what they're not getting, and the reason they're not getting, is because there's no heartbeat in those cops and at the UN. It's a mechanism. It's an artificial intelligence they depend on. The data and what's going on and how much money they're making, that they just totally lost what it's like to say hello to a fellow person and to feel that energy. And we all talked about this, and everybody knows a lot of our prophecies in that they say, you can't eat money. If anybody noticed me, I don't drink this water in water bottles. And if I do, I boil it. Because, see, I'm an elder. And I would rather go drink that water in the river there because it's got the natural minerals that I need. I was at another summit they invited me to with a bunch of scientists and doctors. And I asked that question, why do you have to have 8 to 10 bottles of water, ounces of water, all this stuff in you? Got to stay hydrated. When I remember being a little girl, just souping up water and be able to run the whole day because they had all the natural minerals in it. You can't put something in you that cannot nourish your body. See, they took it out because they keep filtering it and filtering it and filtering it and filtering it. You know, those 4 elements were never, ever meant to be prostituted. That gift of water was freedom for everyone and everything on this planet we call life. The fire was to warm and to do what it was to do as that water has, and so on and so on. And so now we pay a water bill. Now we pay a light bill. We constantly pay land taxes. And what is that saying to us? We did exactly what the elders had said before any intrusion of our lands came. We knew this was going to happen. So we had to stay dormant in a sense. And each one of you will say, I don't remember this, I don't know this, but you do, because it's embraced and it's locked into your blood memory. You see, this up here gets you in trouble. right here where your spirit lives in the center of your universe, will make you think and make you feel. You see, we have to be the truth when we walk amongst what we call the Trojans, the darkness. I have sisters. I talked to this young lady of one of my sisters up in the North Island who recently walked on. And we had this similar conversation, is we will not attack the person with anger. We will attack the darkness in them with love. We will surround them with love. Right? That's what you gotta do. Because if you fight hate with hate, you've lost. You have to be the bigger person, and you have to know the game they're playing. It's as simple as that. And let me tell you, each one of you, wherever I've been or wherever I've seen you, you know, Thomas Joseph, I was up in Canada, it was so doggone cold and stuff, and I was going up there to take Enbridge, a $1 billion invoice over there, not knowing if I was going to be thrown in jail. Thank God I hold dual citizenship. I didn't know what was going to happen to me, but I really didn't care. That had to happen. But I see people rising up more and more. And within this rise, as this unity starts building up as our ancestors foretold, think about it. We are tribal systems that we had to come in association together. We had to become unity in order for each one of us to be sitting here. So when we walk forward and going into this new world of disruption and out there, remember you're a family. And if you disagree, please, please, disagree where that name, when you speak of it, that ear is hearing you. So this is what I want to say in closing. You have to be in that room. It's hard. It's really, really hard of trying to understand their language. But you have each person up here that's going to help get you in those doors and get you to understand, because we have to bring that heartbeat back into that mechanism we call a nightmare. Miigwech.
Thank you. Wow. Let's give people, stand up and appreciate our speakers. This is very emotional to a lot of us. These are real issues, life and death. I have asked a member of our board of directors of IEN, Debra Harry, to come up and put a closing blessing prayer to a lot of these issues that have been expressed. Why I also want to recognize Debra. She's worked in these halls of the UN system for years. Within the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, where the big issue was Article 8J, issues on protocols on the commodification of our medicine knowledge, those things. So she's held a line through fighting against the colonialization of our indigenous knowledge. So I've asked Debra to put a few words and to finish this session with a blessing.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for the work you do, for holding the line, for not giving in, which is the hardest thing to do in these colonial institutions. So I want to thank you for your sacrifices. I also want to say that the work that's going on at the international level is almost like a double-edged sword. It's like if you're not there, you don't know what actions they're taking. If you are there, you can be considered complicit. So it's a very, very hard position to be in. On the other hand, if you're not there and you're not putting in protective language or blocking harmful language, then no one else is there to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. There are no states that are truly allies in this work, because at the end of the day, the state interest is, and their actions is in the interest of the state only. They take care of themselves and their interests first. So for those who are working at that level, it's incredibly challenging, but also very important, because international standards are being established. International treaties are being written. Implementation plans for things that have already been passed are being followed and progressed and advanced. So it's really hard work. But I would say that it can be simple when you think about the reason Indigenous people went in the very beginning, why Diskahe was there, why Ratana was there in 1924 and 34, I think it was, and why the delegations went in 1977. It's pretty simple. It's land, treaties, self-determination. So anything that infringes on those basic fundamental principles of Indigenous peoples needs to be challenged. And if it doesn't advance those things, we're kind of wasting our time. I wanted to say too, on the issue of self-determination and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, when the 4 Kansas states opposed the passage of the UN Declaration in 2007, they did that as a block, right? They did so as a block. And then they eventually came out later with statements in support of the UN Declaration. And I remember when Ambassador Rice stood up in the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and she issued the US statement supporting and endorsing the UN Declaration. But it was a very short statement. What the room didn't know at the time, that there was a 10-page document that explained the US support of the Declaration. Similarly, when the government of New Zealand issued their support, there also is another long document that outlines what they mean when they say support. And so I want to read to you a little bit from the US statement, because this is really, really critically important. If our fundamental inherent right is based on self-determination, this is what the US says they support. Of course, it jumped away from me here. So the US is pleased to support the Declaration's call to promote the development of a new and distinct international concept of self-determination. This is from the 10-page document that's specific to Indigenous peoples. The Declaration's call is to promote the development of a concept of self-determination for Indigenous peoples that is different from the existing right of self-determination in international law. So words are important, because what they're saying And what our position has been is that the right of self-determination is universal. It's a fundamental right of all peoples and nations, not just nation states. So what they're saying is when they support self-determination, it's new and different, which doesn't exist, right? And then they go on to say that their position is based on how they treat us today within the domestic boundaries. So I'm just wanting to point that out because it's very important to look at the detail of the language and what they're really saying, what they mean by what they say. And we can't trust it. We have to be vigilant and always remember those core principles that we have to protect when we go into these spaces, because that's what we have to protect. Tom asked me to do a closing prayer, and it kind of took me by surprise, but I'm gonna do my best. I'm a long-time sun dancer and pipe holder, and that's been the center of my spirit and my work, I guess, is that foundation. My spirit name translates into Chief Eagle Horsewoman, so I'm expected to be one who flies high and sees far and brings messages home to our people. So I'm going to ask us to put our hearts and minds together today to hear the call for unity, to hear the call for solidarity, to hear the call for mutual support, and to hear the call for mutual care and compassion of each other in the work that we have to do to protect the sacredness of all life, to protect the sacredness of who we are as Indigenous peoples, and our connection to our home territories and all that surrounds us in a good way. I ask that you look upon each and every one of us to protect us in our travels and in the work that we have ahead of us, that the work that we do is guided by our Creator and by our ancestors, all in a good way for our future generations. Stand strong, never give up, don't give up anything else, and work to regain, revitalize, recover, reclaim those things that have been taken illegally, stolen from us with violence and with a lot of harm. So stand strong together and let's bring a good future to our future generations. Home takuias.